Welcome everyone. There is no doubt we are currently in a love bubble with technology. Many reasons for this, COVID being one, greater compute capacity through the new cloud infrastructures that are being developed by many of the big providers like Microsoft, and of course more data. Lots more data available, lots more data created, and that's an essential ingredient for machine learning, subfield of AI. There are some really fascinating case studies around AI and robotics in warehouses and fulfillment centres. We now know that Amazon have over 200,000 robots working in their fulfillment centres, and that they are seeing a significant increase in productivity. There are some claims that robots are 3 times more productive in those environments than humans. We know they're quicker at labelling items as well. Amazon are labelling a package every 1 second in some of their warehouses. And of course there's talk about humans operating robots from home, so you could create a fully functioning robotic factory. There are clear benefits. Robots and AI appears to be better at categorization and classification of items, so they tend to get less things wrong when they're putting different items in different chutes. And we know also that they can be better at spotting illnesses. It's not new, as we all know. I mean, AI is being used in supply chain and marketing and sales as we speak in terms of spotting, optimization issues around what kind of things we like to buy and what kind of things we're interested in. However, despite these great strides forward, we are still a long way from something that resembles a human's general intelligence. And AI can't display emotion, as we know. It can't really deal with common sense issues. And we've been on the cusp of this kind of revolution for some time. This technology dates back as far as 1958, and there was a scientist at the time thought that we may be close to having a general intelligence device in 10 years, so by 1968, and clearly we are a long way off that. Dexterity remains an issue for robots. They find it difficult, of course, to pick up small items. And I think that we still have challenges around some of these powerful algorithms that are used in neural networks or deep learning, the opacity of them. We don't really understand how they work, and it becomes very difficult for people to ensure that they don't have natural bias or discrimination. I saw something actually recently from Gartner. Some of you may know that Gartner do this kind of tech hype reports every so often, where they talk about the technology that's in the hype bubble, where people are talking a lot about it. And there was one piece of technology around blockchain that could be used to authenticate algorithms, and I thought that was really interesting. I can't pretend to understand it because it's way too complex, but this idea that you need another edge technology to verify the veracity of algorithms in AI, I think, is a really interesting issue. And of course we know that there are loads of data protection issues. We're not going to focus massively on those today, but as you create more data, as that data is repurposed, there are legitimate concerns about privacy. You may remember that there was a device, it was a piece of wrist technology that was developed that enables a robot to kind of guide a human's hand to the right tray in a stack of pallets. And there was a massive outcry about this because everyone was saying that's just such an infringement on workers' rights, and it just goes way too far and it's kind of inhumane and all that kind of thing. Despite that, there's no doubt that tech is being used more in different and innovative ways, and you don't need me, and we'll come on to what the purpose of this webinar is, you don't need me to tell you that the law is straggling a little bit behind that. It always does, because there are really complex and challenging issues around IP and employment law issues. So in the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to look at what's happening in technology. We're going to talk to you about what our clients are telling us, what our experiences of it are, and we're going to look at it particularly in the context of employment law, because obviously there's a big piece here around people and automation, and also in the context of intellectual property, where the rights that are derived from some of this really clever technology are going to be complex. and there's going to be some tricky issues, I think, going forward around that, particularly in relation to data. So I'm delighted to be joined by Charlotte Smith, the senior lawyer in our employment team, and Alan Harper, the head of our intellectual property practice. And they're going to talk us through their experiences and answer some questions that I think we're all interested in. Forgive us for a bit of Star Wars self-indulgence in some of our questions, but we couldn't resist, because when you start to look at some of this technology, you just can't stop yourself from imagining all sorts of fantastical things. So we've got a little bit of that peppered in it. Let's start, Charlotte, can I start with you? What are you seeing businesses and clients doing in terms of automation and technology? Are you seeing people asking you specific questions around that?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what you were saying in your introduction, Sally. I think there are different businesses that are at completely varying levels with this. So we work with a lot of businesses in the manufacturing sector and particularly the food and drink industry. And, you know, we've been lucky enough to go and see some of their factories, and they are already quite advanced, you would think. They have, you know, smart factories, lots of machinery that can make sure things are produced very quickly. So some businesses are already up there, others may not have considered it as much. But I think it's definitely a developing area, and it's definitely one of the key trends that we are seeing our clients focus on more. And as part of our sort of sector group that we have here for the manufacturing sector, we were lucky enough to go to the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, which is a facility in Sheffield, and they work with the University of Sheffield. And they have sort of a factory of the future that they allow businesses to sort of rent out a space within that factory, and they can use that to develop their own technology. So I think that's sort of where this is going with businesses who might have already been fairly advanced, but they're now even developing their own smart technology, and you see things that are as advanced as sort of augmented realities. And I recently saw an article that said that Nestle had developed their own augmented reality, which allowed sort of your traditional engineer who needs to fix a machine to fix a machine that's on the other side of the world, because they can do it all virtually on a screen. So there's things that are as advanced as that. The clients who potentially haven't thought about it as much yet, I think it's definitely been a focus from the government as well in response to the pandemic that we're in. You know, you need social distancing, you need people to be able to carry out jobs remotely, and also the uncertainties that are associated with Brexit as well. It's been a key focus on their sort of post-Brexit immigration strategy. We're going to need more techie people. So while I haven't really seen specific employment-related theories yet, I think what we are seeing is clients who are factoring this into sort of their strategy planning, particularly their HR strategy planning, because it is inevitably going to have an impact on the workforce. And I think there's been a really recent study actually by the Confederation of British Industry, which predicts that 9 out of 10 people will need to reskill in the next 10 years if they are going to be able to sort of keep up with this in the new roles which are required.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting your point about COVID, actually, because I saw some commentary recently, and this isn't necessarily my view, but I thought it was quite an interesting commentary, that you would have thought, whilst people were working from home and they were using a lot of tech in the pandemic, the actual track and trace is kind of being really untechy, like putting like signs on the floor and ringing people up when you think that they've been infected by it, and it's kind of gone a bit the other way, actually, interestingly. So I mean, that's just a view, but I thought that was quite an interesting point. What about the intellectual property side, Alan? What's happening there? Are we getting more clients alive to the IP aspects of new technologies, AI, automation?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, there's a couple of different areas in this, really. First and foremost, this is a technology procurement exercise. People are buying this technology in. You know, the majority of businesses don't have this expertise themselves, so they are working with third parties to enable them to have this capability. Now, when they're doing that, they are acquiring someone else's permissions to use their IP, so there's naturally an intellectual property element in there. And because this is cutting edge, these businesses who are giving out this technology, who are commercializing it themselves, they are obviously needing to protect their own IP rights. So there is a real balance here from the technology procurement angle in respect to the IP issues. And what we're also seeing as well is that businesses are often taking third-party technology, but it doesn't quite do what they need it to do, so they are having to develop it themselves, and with that they're generating their own IP. So there is that tension there between who owns what, and ownership of IP is always a key issue. So there is a real point there about the IP vesting in this new technology, who owns it, who can do what with it. So we're seeing a lot of interest around that.
Yeah.
That's more on the practical side. On the legal side, not necessarily in the industry, but intellectual property law as a whole is very interested in this. There's been a lot of talk about the role of IP and also what that's going to mean for, AI/IP, and there's been a lot of commentary in the IP global legal community talking about where the law needs to be to match up with technology. So we're starting to see that filter into practical examples of the day-to-day, but at the moment it's still very much an academic exercise, but it's not too far away that we can see these legal questions. We need to have answers because the practical is going to catch up.
And it's funny actually, because I'm, as you know, as you both know, but maybe the audience don't know, I'm a technology lawyer. And we are seeing, we're obviously seeing people buying off-the-shelf solutions that maybe help with some of this optimization technology we talked around sales and marketing. But I don't think we're seeing too many people diving into they see it as buying a technology product at the moment. I don't think that they're diving too much into the kind of AI or machine learning aspects of that, other than probably in relation to data, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on in the session. Charlotte, just on the employment side, are we seeing concerns about robots taking over workforces completely and mass redundancy programs and how they might be managed? Is that on the agenda yet, or are we?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that inevitably, at some point in the future, certain roles will be taken over, potentially completely by robots or by machinery. And again, I think there's been a study by the World Economic Forum that predicts that half of the roles we do could be carried out by a machine in the next 5 to 10 years. So I do think that there are certain roles which will be taken over by technology, but it's only certain roles, and I think they are generally the ones which are, they require repetitive tasks to be done, or potentially more administrative type roles. And that's because obviously if you're thinking about a repetitive task that needs to be done on a factory line, a robot can do it much better than a human, and a robot is superior to a human in many ways because they don't need the national minimum wage, they don't need rest breaks, they don't need to go and take a holiday, they're not going to have a sick day. So if you think about all of that, if you want to increase your production, then it is inevitable that there are certain roles, and it's generally what we class as, the lower paid, lower skill roles that are likely to be taken over by machinery. But I think there are certain roles that won't lend themselves well to technology, and we still are going to need people who can do the human element of things. So even if you look in sort of our profession, in the legal profession, there might be some administrative tasks that can be done by technology, and we already are investing in that as law firms. Potentially some of the lower value legal work as well in terms of contract reviews, etc. But I think you are still going to need humans who are able to sort of analyse the law and provide, that advice, because while a robot might be able to learn the law and tell you what it is and what the options are, I think you're still going to need people who can think about commercial realities or the more human, emotional side of things. So there are certain roles that I think we will stick around. And then, the other obvious point is that more roles will be created by the increased use of tech, because we're going to need people who can actually develop that technology and then use it, analyse it, make it better. So I think there's probably as many roles that will be created as those will not be there anymore.
We certainly hope we still need lawyers, don't we? What do you, in terms of sort of training, do you see that workforces are going to have to undergo a kind of new training program to deal with potentially a completely different environment in their workplace, particularly, I guess, in warehousing and production lines? What's the thinking there?
Yeah, I think it's right. I think businesses need to plan ahead. And again, this is quite a strong message that's coming from the government as well. There is a recognition that the workforce will need to upskill, and it goes back to that statistic about 9 in 10 people might need to retrain in order to remain relevant to the workforce in the future. And I think, you'd be forgiven for missing it, but the government has actually announced that it's going to increase funding into what they call a lifetime skills guarantee, which is aimed at that. It's aimed at people who already have jobs, but they actually might need to retrain and reskill to get better in terms of technology, etc. And I think they're looking at making things more flexible in terms of the way that you study as well, because the model at the moment is, you go to university or whatever, you get your degree and then you work and then you stay in that profession potentially for the rest of your life. Whereas I think there's a recognition now that the workforce is changing and it will change in line with technology. So we need to have more flexibility in that system. And similarly, I think apprenticeships as well, there's a big focus on those at the moment, because that's obviously a way in which you can make sure you have somebody in your workforce who is learning on the job. They're learning how to use the technology, how to develop it. So again, there's increased funding for that, especially for SMEs. And that's also been a big response to the pandemic as well, is further investment in apprenticeships. I think the other point as well with recruitment practices is that I think there is an acceptance that in the UK we do have a lack of people who have sort of a STEM subject background. So the new immigration that is coming into play from January next year very much focuses on people who've got that experience in STEM backgrounds. And that is one of the ways in which you can sort of trade points under the system for a lower salary level, is if you are recruiting somebody who has a degree in that subject. So there is a recognition there that that's what we need to be focusing on, definitely.
So those are really interesting points, Charlotte. So just to sort of summarise, you're saying that you think there'll be funding available from government to retrain people with the right sorts of skills for kind of an automated factory, and I guess you'd recommend that people start to look into that now if they're operating those environments where that might be quite useful, and don't forget about this apprenticeship thing, which again I think you're saying is a really useful mechanism to maybe get the right skill set for the workforce of the future, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I wouldn't want to hold the government to anything at the moment, given where we're at, but that is definitely what has been announced, and I think that is definitely the intention, and regardless of what funding is or isn't available, it's definitely a focus to sort of HR strategy planning, I would say.
Could you just talk a little bit more about the overseas point that you made, and that presumably is to do with Brexit, is it, and STEMs?
Yeah, so I think there's been a really big concern from particularly the manufacturing industry, particularly the food and drink industry, that there could be a shortage of labour following our exit from the transition period when free movement ends, because traditionally that sector has relied quite heavily on European workers to sort of staff the production line in those roles which are generally classed as lower skilled roles. And from January next year, free movement will end and we will not be able to recruit from overseas for those lower skilled roles. Instead, it's a new skills-based system and people will have to be skilled to a certain level. And in the immigration policy paper, the government has acknowledged that that will be an adjustment for employers. Employers will need to think of new solutions to that, because they are not going to put in place an exceptions route where you can recruit, lots of European workers to work on the production line at national minimum wage. Instead, they have said we expect you to be investing in technology. This is what we expect. We want to create this high wage, high skill economy, hence the emphasis on sort of STEM subjects being one of the ways in which you can recruit people.
Yeah, interesting, very interesting. Let's turn to some analysis, oh, I can't say that word, of new tech in terms of the legal aspects of it in terms of employment. So is a robot going to be a person for purposes of employment law?
Yeah, and it's a good question, but as it stands, no, a robot is not a person for purposes of employment law. As we talked about before, they're not protected in the same way that workers are. They don't get national minimum wage, they don't get rest breaks, they don't get holidays. And, you know, if you said, I don't want to use this robot anymore, they obviously couldn't take the employer to court for unfair dismissal. So as it stands, they are absolutely not classed as a human for the purposes of employment law. But I guess it's not ridiculous to think that at some point in the future they could be, when technology advances even further, and I guess when robots start to have their own personalities.
Sometime in the future. And in terms of a recruitment process, if you could see again, I mean, this is probably a long way down the road, isn't it? It's a bit of our Star Wars navel gazing, but you could see a scenario where if you've got a vacancy and it could be filled by an automated device or a human, what do you think that employers might start to need to do in that scenario to ensure a kind of fair process?
Yeah, and again, it's a good question. As it stands, obviously, as a business, you can recruit whoever you think is best for the role. So if you think you need a robot instead of a human, for all of the reasons that we just talked about, you know, they're quicker, they don't need rest breaks, then you can certainly decide not to recruit a human being for a production line role when a robot could do it instead. I suppose the only thing that you need to be mindful of as an employer at the moment is to not discriminate as part of the recruitment process. And that means, you know, you can't discriminate on the grounds of sex or race or any of the protected characteristics. And obviously we were laughing about it yesterday, but as it stands, being a human being is not a protected characteristic for the purposes of employment law. But again, you just never know. I know we're talking future gazing here. Could it be a protected characteristic to be a human over a robot? I don't know. It's something for years down the line, I think.
And one of the question about is a robot a person for the purpose of employment law really leads me into the next question around responsibility for actions of robots, because clearly that's going to be a big thing, isn't it? And as they get more sophisticated, as we've seen, you know, in some of the Amazon fulfillment houses, you can see how they're doing more tasks, they're interacting more closely with humans on the factory floor. There could be accidents, there could be a variety of reasons for those accidents. It could be driven by a human error, it could be driven by a fault in the technology, etc. Where are we at the moment with that, and do you think that there will be further legislation needed to deal with that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that is the key question in all of this, is accountability. And, you know, when you read things about technology or you listen to a podcast or whatever, the key question is who is accountable for this tech. I think we can safely assume that the default position is that you as the employer are going to be liable for anything that goes wrong, in the same way that you are liable for what an employee does in the course of their employment. You're vicariously liable for them. I think you can safely assume that if you've put that machinery on the factory line and it's caused something to happen, then you as the company, you will be liable, and obviously potentially the directors of the company as well. But it is a very good question, and I think you're right that the law is likely to develop in this area, because could it actually be that the person who made the technology, should they be liable for it for the way that they programmed it, or could it be the case that the person who is operating the technology should be liable for it? And there's already been various examples of how things have gone wrong with technology and with AI. I think the big one was, I think Microsoft put out a chatbot which was called Tay. They put it out on Twitter, and it was supposed to be this experimental conversationalist robot who could have a conversation with people, but it only took a matter of hours for it to start tweeting things that were sexist and racist and misogynistic, and it quickly learned all of that from humans. So yes, the question is, who was behind creating that, and did they have enough regulation in place to make sure that that wouldn't happen and it wouldn't learn those things from humans? So yeah, it's a good question.
And I think that goes back to the point I was making around the algorithms that power a lot of this really clever stuff, especially on the deep learning side. You know, it's very difficult to avoid discrimination, isn't it, as you said? And that's one of the challenges, I think, well, in all fields of this technology, but particularly in relation to employment. How do you stop that bias and that discrimination? I mean, I think this is very interesting in terms of how this will be legislated, because as a technology procurement lawyer, I know that it's very unlikely this problem will be passed back to the manufacturer of the actual technology, because it's very typical in these kinds of contracts that liability for lots of things are excluded. And you can understand why that is, because the suppliers are not in charge of the environment in which a lot of this technology is deployed, and they can't understand the risk associated with that, and that's why a lot of the clauses in these contracts are excluded. So it seems to me it's going to be very, very unlikely that risk will be passed back to the suppliers, and they will be starting, I think, to include clauses in their contracts that really make that very, very clear. You can kind of then move to a world that says, well, is there going to be is it going to be vicarious liability? Is it going to be strict liability? All those sorts of points are really quite interesting on this, aren't they? And how will this be dealt with? Because you can imagine all sorts of complex litigation around whose fault it was and who took that responsibility. What do you think about, if you're a human, and you're in some kind of disciplinary hearing, how do you think that that will work if you want to bring a robot as a witness?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, again, it's something to think about for the future. And it all goes back to the point of, are they intelligent beings or not? I think at the moment we wouldn't get there. I think the bigger concern at the moment is the way that technology is being used potentially to bring people to disciplinary hearings or to performance management hearings, for example. And again, I think the example that we've seen in the past is in warehouses, and I think the Amazon warehouse actually, where they track what people's productivity levels are using automated software, and if you fall below a certain point, then you're all automatically there in the bottom 5%, you get dragged to a performance management hearing or a disciplinary hearing, and obviously your job's at risk. So I think that's the way that we might be seeing problems in technology and how they're used, because obviously they are very good at monitoring people, but the problem is they can't necessarily take into consideration why that might be happening. Are there any mitigating circumstances? Does this person need help, for example? So I think that's probably the bigger problem that we're going to face, is how is technology actually going to be used fairly and properly when monitoring people and disciplining people?
Yeah, and of course you then run into a whole host of data protection issues there, don't you, in terms of if you're kind of automatically monitoring or managing people, then, is there transparency around that, is there fairness, and there's a really big piece, I think, around all of that.
Yeah.
So we touched on discrimination, and I'd just be interested in your thoughts on, and we've talked about how, it's very difficult sometimes to prevent a machine from learning discriminatory behaviours, even in an unconscious way. What are your thoughts really on how that might all play out, Charlotte, in terms of legal development?
Yeah, I think it's a really key question, and there's some really good commentary actually on this. I think one of the podcasts which I listen to, it's called the Racism at Work podcast, talks about this, and it will be a very big issue, and we've seen it played out. I think there was the Home Office was criticised for having an algorithm that was potentially biased, and a robot or an algorithm learns in the same way as a human, doesn't it? So the person who's programming it, if they program it with a certain specific person in mind or to do a specific thing, that is going to feed through to the robot. And the example, I think, that was given on the podcast I was listening to was they were testing driverless cars, and the driverless car could detect a pedestrian who had a light skin tone really well, because the person who programmed it had a specific person in mind when they were doing that, but they couldn't detect somebody who had a darker skin tone. So again, it's those ingrained biases, whether unconscious or conscious, that are going to feed through to all of that. So I think you're right, it's probably an area that needs to be legislated on more and regulated in terms of who is developing the technology, because again, I've seen a lot of criticism about the fact that people will buy this technology, but they don't know how it's actually been coded, and the people who are manufacturing it are very reluctant to say how that has been done. So that's the problem, is where's the regulation, who's going to be accountable, and who can explain how that decision came about to implement that technology and develop it in that certain way?
Yeah, no. We've talked about challenges and areas that we think there's going to be more legal development and probably case law and regulation, etc. But there's an upside to this as well, isn't there, Charlotte? There's some positives coming too, I think. Do you want to just touch on that to finish this section?
Yeah, 100%. And, you know, you mentioned a lot of them as well in your introduction. We've already mentioned that the robots can take away some of the jobs that potentially humans might not want to do. They're the more boring jobs or the more manual jobs. So, you know, physically, it's probably better for robots to do certain manual labour, and that means that humans don't have to do that. The tasks are not necessarily as strenuous. It can also help potentially in terms of, you know, working time. You don't have to have loads of people on the factory line doing ridiculous overtime hours or nighttime shifts. I think as well, you know, for people who have disabilities, technology can be a great thing, because again, it can stop things that, you know, physically somebody might not have been able to do a job, like when we touched on an engineer who has to fix a piece of machinery. If somebody has a physical disability, they might not be able to do that, but in an augmented reality, in a virtual world, they may now be able to do that role. So I think it's definitely good in terms of there are a lot of opportunities with this, and I think that's why it's just going to become a bigger and bigger talking point. People are going to be investing more in it, but it's just more about planning for the future and how you implement that into the workforce.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, Charlotte, thank you. Alan, right, put you in the hot seat now. Some questions around intellectual property. We've already touched, and you touched on the beginning, that IP is going to be so critical in some of this stuff. What sorts of clients are looking to you for advice at the moment on this area, Alan?
So as you'd expect, we're getting a lot of the traditional manufacturers that are coming to us about this, and as Charlotte's mentioned, there's a lot of focus in the industry at the moment in terms of the traditional manufacturers looking at how they can change their processes, improve their processes, and really deploy this technology to assist and bring all the benefits that Charlotte touched upon. But we're also seeing other types of businesses looking at this as well, and as we've touched upon, a lot of this technology, I think we as people who look at this not in the development side but more on the advisor side, we have in our head that this is a robot. It's a physical humanoid-esque machine, but actually there's a lot more on this that's more process orientated, and it's software and AI, and that's where you're seeing a lot of this actually being deployed in non-manufacturing businesses as well as traditional manufacturing businesses. And as Charlotte touched upon, and as you know, Sally, because we've talked about this in the context of Walker Morris, but professional services are all over this. They're looking at this as to how they can deploy this to improve the client experience, and also really to free up its fee earners to do more appropriate tasks. I mean, disclosure is a great example of that, and we're seeing that litigation is being reviewed root and branch because of how a AI system can be used in traditional litigation. Gone are the days of a trainee being locked in a back room working through 100 lever arch files, because actually if we can get a machine to do it, then everybody wins. So it's really interesting. So yeah, we're seeing a broad array of clients that are interested in this, but as you would expect, traditional manufacturers are the most focused.
Just remind us, Alan, of the sort of key areas of IP law that are relevant to this kind of new edge technology automation.
So in terms of the physical manifestation of the technology and the processes, as you would expect, this is patents. So patents protect inventions. So a lot of this is patent. We're talking about the world of patents. And that patents cover both products and processes. So we're seeing it in both areas. So we're seeing patented products as in a physical thing that does a particular task. But we're also seeing it in a process sense as well. So people are able to use AI as part of a process, and that's sort of patents are really sort of catching up with this, and we'll come on to talk about patent law, some of that blue sky thinking we talked about, but patents are certainly the focus. But then anything that's anything that's software is copyright. So that is AI, algorithms, etc., where you are writing code that is protected as a function of copyright law in English law. So patents and copyrights are the focus.
So imagine I'm a customer, factory owner, I'm going to invest in this new technology. What sorts of issues do you think I need to be raising with a supplier from an IP perspective? Do I need to be pushing to own as much of this technology as I can?
As we touched upon, first and foremost, this is a technology procurement exercise. This is you as a potential consumer looking to get third-party technology to assist. So yeah, I think it's important not to lose sight of that when you're talking about these kind of endeavours. But from an IP perspective, there's a lot of things that you need to think about in terms of the IP. First and foremost, it's the basis upon which you're going to be using it. So are you going to get a license to use it? What terms are those? What are the license terms? And in terms of answering your point about ownership, that's a really interesting point. As Charlotte mentioned, there's a lot of defensiveness on the developer side about how their technology works, and obviously that's because it's sensitive and it's new. So in order for you to take an assignment of that, it's going to be very rare that a third party is going to give you their intellectual property. Clearly, if there's a cost involved, then they may be interested. But first and foremost, a lot of these providers are looking about how they can use this, not just with one potential customer, but with several, perhaps even tens and hundreds. So in terms of taking an assignment, that's something that's always going to be a challenge. But yeah, ownership is an interesting point in terms of who might own what, and we'll touch upon that in a bit. But yeah, so ownership and permission is a key point to think about. And then in terms of the broader sense of the license, the IP element pervades everything. So when you're looking about the IP issues, you need to think about maintenance, you need to think about service contracts, because okay, you've acquired your technology, it's great, it's working, but all of a sudden it might be broken, and who's going to fix it? Have you got the tools that you need to tinker with that, and do you have the permissions from an IP perspective to do that? So this is where you're going to see a really interesting, I think that you're going to see a lot of these businesses will pivot into service businesses, and they will, and this goes back to Charlotte's point about, upskilling your workforce. Are you as an employee going to invest in something, in an individual who can maintain this, or are you actually going to just go to your third-party supplier who provided it in the first instance and sign up to a service contract as well? So there's a lot in the IP mix really to think about.
And I think, conversely, if I'm a supplier of that new technology, I think it's interesting to look at the sorts of issues that suppliers will be thinking about. And maybe on this one we just drill down a bit more, Alan, into the different types of IP. Do you need to be more cautious if you're selling a technology product that incorporates machine learning, automation, than you would be if you were just selling a straightforward piece of application software?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's going to be very interesting. At the moment, we're talking about this, these robots as one entity, but we know that won't be the case. There'll be lots of different elements that feed into how that ultimately works. So it may be a case that you can go to your supplier and you can buy a single machine which does the task. For example, it puts chocolates in the box for me, that kind of technology. But actually, I think we're going to be looking at things that are a lot smarter than that, and they'll need to work with bits of other technology, and this is where the suppliers are going to be interested, because they're going to be saying, okay, well, you can buy this product form from me, and as part of that you will get a license to use the intellectual property therein. But in terms of it plugging into all this other technology which we can offer you as well, then actually that's a different price point. So I think we're going to see a lot of suppliers who really have a broad solution of what they can offer, and some of it will be at the more simple end and some of it will be at the more complex end, and the IP elements in those will very much be a case of what you need as a buyer, and of course as a supplier there'll be a commercial aspect to that.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, in the past, you know, if you were buying some technology from a supplier, you'd just see a sort of simple line that said the supplier owns all the IP in the software, or the supplier owns all the IP in the hardware. Now I'm starting to see on some deals where I own all the IP in the software, but I own all the IP in the algorithms, I own all the IP in the code libraries. Is that a distinction? You know, if there's an algorithm built into a piece of software, has that got its own intellectual property rights that are distinctive from the code that's been written in the software application? And maybe there's no answer to that, Alan, actually, but these are the sorts of questions and problems I think we're going to start encountering, because I think what's happening with this technology is it's driving more granular analysis of the technology stack, and people are wanting to carve it up into all sorts of different buckets. And I find myself sitting there thinking, having done technology for 25 years, this is just getting so confusing now. I don't really know what I'm getting anymore, and what I own and what I can do. And
absolutely.
There's a real risk with this. Sorry, and so I'm just interested really from an IP perspective about that, because
I think that's really interesting. I think there's a couple of points there. I think first and foremost, your comment about traditional arrangement where you as a supplier would just say you can use the IP that vests in the product I've supplied you, full stop, but we retain all rights. I don't think that's going to be quite sufficient anymore, and actually, you know, on both sides of that relationship, both supplier and consumer, because the suppliers are going to want to make sure that they don't give things away that perhaps they want to commercialize elsewhere. So you're going to start to see much more nuance in your contracts. So, you know, you look at this in other IP license senses. If this was a brand license, for example, you might say, okay, well, you can only use part of my brand in a certain territory for certain fields of use, as in you can only use it for a particular food product. And I think we're going to start to see that with this kind of technology. You know, suppliers will say, okay, you know, you can use it for this purpose, for this term in this territory, and that's it, because they're going to really want to control how this technology is used, because they'll want to commercialize it. Now, of course, the balance to this and the flip is the point that you touched upon with Charlotte, which is the liability point. And you know, it'd be interesting to see how the law pans out on that, because if ultimately the suppliers of this technology start to see some of that liability being pushed back onto them, then you're going to see licenses being very carefully drafted, because of course they're going to want to make sure that, you know, you can do it. If we're going to take liability, sure, okay, we accept that that's the law, but if you're going to use our technology, you can only do it for X, Y, Z. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that balance comes out.
I think you're absolutely right, Alan, because I think what's going through probably what's going through suppliers' heads is, I'm giving you a piece of machine learning, and you can use it in the way that I own it, but you can use it in the way that you might use any other software application in your business. But there's a powerful algorithm in that software that I think is super clever, and you can't use that. You can't somehow take that out of that product. I don't even know if this is technically possible. You can't somehow take that out of the product, put it in something else, and use it in a different way.
Correct.
And that is where I think the complexity is going to go. And it leads me on to my next question, which is, you know, you may buy a robot, you may buy a right to use a robot, you might buy some technology that powers an automation device. And what happens if that device creates some intellectual property? You don't own the device because you've allowed the supplier to use it, but what happens if it creates something? Where are we in that?
Yeah, so this is where you do start to get into a mix of blue sky thinking, but also some practical applications. So a number of years ago, the audience may have seen there was a copyright case revolving a monkey that took a photograph of itself, the monkey selfie case as it's known in the IP world. And PETA, the animal rights organization in the US, actually ran a case in the US courts to claim that the monkey had autonomy, it was an individual, and therefore it could qualify for copyright protection, because if it was a human being and had it taken a selfie of itself, it would have owned the copyright in the photo. So there was a lot of commentary at the time about, you know, what impact this has. And of course the analogy was immediately drawn to AI, which is, well, hang on, okay, we may as a society accept that this particular monkey doesn't have the same rights as a human being, but what are we going to do in a few years' time when we've got machinery, AI, software developing this stuff? And Charlotte mentioned the chatbot earlier. Again, we're seeing you know, loads of examples now of AI creating copyright, you know, artistic works, movie trailers, things like that, very sort of, you know, benign things, but it's not hard to see this being given commercial application. And we've actually recently, there was a decision in the patents court where an individual filed a patent and named the machine as the inventor, and this went through the UK court system. There was a decision on it very recently. And under Section 7 of the Patents Act, there was a requirement that the inventor must be any person, and the court decided that the machine did not constitute the requirements of an inventor because it was not a person. So you've already seen the courts reject the idea that this machine could be a person for the purposes of patent law. Now, again, is the law going to have to change there? Probably, but right now, if you're in that situation where you're letting your machines loose and they are generating IP, you've got to be really careful, because if, you know, if all of a sudden your machine develops something which is brilliant, then you may not be able to claim protection for it.
I think we've got a question actually. I've just noticed that there's somebody asking about manufacturing equipment and then developing it to clients' needs, and then customers wanting to own kind of the development from that. And I think it kind of sits with this point that we're talking about, that where you are actually manufacturing equipment or you're writing software that is AI savvy or has machine learning capabilities so that it can go on and do further things and create new intellectual property rights, you probably start to now think about what you put in your contracts around that, and restrictions on what further uses might be made of that. In terms of the AI elements, and I think it's going to be complicated, but I do think we are probably on that journey now where we need to start thinking about those sorts of issues. Whereas in the past it was a machine, it did one thing, it didn't evolve, it didn't grow, it didn't develop into other things in that way. And this is it's a complex but fascinating area. But I think, you know, in terms of your checklist of things you need to be thinking about, this is probably one of them, isn't it?
And I think just on this question that's come in, on the bespoking element, I think this is where it's going to be really interesting, because we're talking at the moment where a supplier is saying, okay, here's your technology, but we all know it's very rarely going to actually work like that initially, because there's still a lot of development that's going on where you're going to these providers who might have the robot, but actually to make that work in your setting, you're going to have to tailor it to your needs. So the bespoke element is really key. And in a situation at the moment, I'm seeing a lot of tension because these developers who are providing the machinery are looking at the bespoke output and they're thinking, actually, this is really a really effective use of our technology, and we'd love to commercialize this with others. And you're seeing the consumers of that who have got the bespoking, all of a sudden they're thinking to themselves, okay, great, I want to make sure that this technology works for me and that it does what I need it to do, and that I've got the permission to do it. But then they think to themselves, well, hang on, if we've just devised this really clever process that we know works, maybe actually we'd like to own it because we might want to commercialize it. And this is where you're going to start to get a real tension, because ultimately the solutions that are going to be provided, they're going to need a lot of bespoking, and you're going to see this real tension between customer and supplier as to who owns that. And particularly if you've got a supplier that's going to say, okay, great, yeah, you can thanks for your bespoke input and for us getting this to where you need it to be, but don't forget we'll actually retain ultimate ownership, and we might actually license this technology to someone in the US where you're not active because we know somebody's interested there. So I think there's going to be a real tension there. I mean, as it stands right now, answering the question, I think the ultimate point is going to be just contractual, just making sure that your contract is clear in terms of making sure that ownership is dealt with, improvements, bespoking, just so that there's a clear understanding so that you don't have any of these arguments.
And my next question was really around commercial exploitation, but I think you've probably covered that really in what you've just said, Alan, around it. We've talked about kind of buying technology and licensing technology for internal use, but of course there's a whole piece here around commercial exploitation, and I think you've probably covered that in terms of saying think about that, think about what might happen and how that might be divided between customer and supplier. I think it's really fascinating. I think that takes us neatly onto data, because again, you know, this whole area around AI and automation is driven by data. It uses data to learn, as we've talked about already, but it also creates data. And there's a whole issue really, isn't there, around who owns that, who has rights over that. Are there IP rights in data, Alan? Put us out of our misery.
No, well, as you know, we've talked about this before. No is the short answer. It's a form of potentially confidential information, and there may be forms of copyright in it, but as a piece of data, as a concept, no, it does not protect. It is not protected as a form of IP. There's no specific IP right for data. There are other elements of IP law that can protect it, but there are no, you can't put an IP right on data per se. And it's as as you know, Sally, we had the contract earlier in the year where you have this situation where somebody will supply technology and they'll say, great, yeah, here's your license to use it, but by the way, we own all the data. And this again comes into this ownership point. And what's going to be interesting to see is all of these technologies, the AIs in particular, they work because of the data that they can be fed with and also collect in order to learn. Alexa's a great example of that. It is learning because everybody is asking it questions day in, day out, and it's taking all this and learning. And you're going to have this situation where a supplier will say, okay, great, here's the machinery to use in your factory, but we'd actually quite like to keep owning the data that you're generating during the lifetime of your contract. And you know, maybe that's linked into the service contract element as well. So you're going to see a really interesting life cycle for this technology, because I think there'll be an initial purchase, but then the lifetime piece is going to be far more interesting than traditional supply arrangement where they just say, okay, here's a machine for your factory. If it breaks, you know where to find me. And it's going to be a lot more complicated than that.
No, agreed. Future law, we talked about it with Charlotte in terms of what's like to come down the tracks in terms of regulation around employment. What's the story on IP? It sounds to me like we might need some more law here.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. As I said, referencing the recent patent decision case, as it stands at the moment, things that are created by non-humans are not protected as forms of IP. So it could be argued that the individual who set that robot on its task is ultimately the creator, the programmer who taught it to do these things. But I can see quite quickly a lot of conceptual and practical problems with that. Yep. So I think we're going to see a real change in the law in the coming years, where IP law is going to have to recognize AI as a creator, because ultimately, whilst we as a society might feel a bit uncomfortable about giving, essentially this is a human right, it's a right of recognition as the right to property, we as a society might feel uncomfortable about that. So I think it's going to have to be really carefully drafted, and I can see a situation where it is recognised that an AI can create IP, but it's the owner of that AI that takes the benefit of it, and that's probably how I can see this working. But then you're into really blue sky thinking about, well, ultimately, you know, do these robots attract human rights, and therefore can they be owned? So it's going to be, yeah, really complex area. Lots of legal updates needed, I think.
No, that's fantastic. We're almost out of time, actually. I think we've got one question. Thank you very much for the person who asked that. If you've got anything else, please do type it in quickly before we close. I think that's been a really interesting session. I've certainly enjoyed going through all the different elements of this, and I think we've thrown up some really big points, haven't we? For me, I guess the takeaways are, in the area of employment, I think it's going to be around algorithm discrimination and how do you manage that. You know, that seems to me to be really a massive, massive issue there. I think on the IP and the data, Alan, for me, these are going to be about really documenting in the contract exactly in a lot more granular detail than probably we have done in the past, both in relation to the different elements of the technology. We talked about algorithms, we talked about code libraries, how can they be used going forward, really documenting those clearly in the contract. And the same with data, because you can't really at the moment flip back onto the law for kind of unwritten protection there, can you? You've got to be absolutely super clear in your contract, and unfortunately I think that's going to mean we're going to see much more complexity around the drafting in the procurement contracts for these kinds of things. But I think they are the sort of immediate takeaways. I know we're all going to be monitoring the situation carefully in terms of regulation and what's coming out and what the government is saying about all these different areas, and we will of course be sure to send that out to you all when we know anything. But I think I just wanted to conclude to say thank you very much for joining. Hope you're still here with us, and hope you found that a useful session, and look forward to doing another one of these shortly. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.